Hello everyone, welcome back. Welcome back to the Technology Innovation Hub. So it's going to be another session from DevOps portal. Let me share the screen. Okay, so we have been doing 4 sessions on DevOps on the DevOps portal in with Minikube, right? So you may remember we just did the second session on getting familiar with Minikube, right? Overall, we have done 4 sessions. So overall, it's going to be the 5th session, and on getting familiar with Minikube is going to be the 3rd session, right? So, and still it's going to be competency level 3, right? So let's go further and enhance our skills and competencies with getting familiar with Minikube. Right. Okay. Let's start the session, practical session right away. All right. So I think this is where we stopped, right? So we did basic pod we created, and we observed the output, and we got to know the IP addresses, and because we create 2 pods, right? If I'm not mistaken, we did the command line pod creation, and we ran with the within the manifest file as well, right? And we checked the 2 IPs is assigned for each pod, right? So I think that this is the last practical we did, right? Yeah. Yes, so this is what we have been doing on the last practical. Yes, we checked the details of kube control, describe my pod, and yeah, we did the manifest file as well, and I think we went through the command line as well. Exactly, yeah, we ran kubectl, run my nginx. Okay, we did the same practical, just creating a pod resource with the nginx image, and we did the same thing with the manifest file as well, right? Okay, those we have done. So today, and I think we stopped. I was about to start on deployment, right? On a deployment. So let's start from there, right? Yes, let's do a basic deployment, right? So this is what. So first thing is this. Now, in this session, we are not going to get into more details on the deployment, right? Because we are just starting the Minikube practicals. But it's better to have a basic understanding on what is a deployment and like. So later, with more details, we will do deployment, because in Kubernetes, now if you want to run application, right? Now in normal environment, let's say you want to run a Java file, Java application, you want to run a .NET one, or you want to run something else, let's say Python or whatever, you just say running application, right? But in Kubernetes, we don't say we are running application. So we say we are deploying a workload, right? And again, we are not telling application even, right? Running application, no. Running is replaced by deployment, application replaced by workload, right? So that's how it's going to be. So we are telling deploying a workload. So that is what we are going to do now. So so what do you mean by deployment? Again, at the end of the deployment, you are going to, like in a normal environment, you are going to have the same application up and running in the normal environment. So when the deployment running means, workload running means, same way your application will become accessible. On the behind, different thing is happening. Now in a normal environment, you are running the whatever the Java file, and it's going to consume some memory, and it's going to run, right? Maybe JVM or something in .NET, on the .NET platform, likewise. So it's going to be that. But in Kubernetes, what's going to happen with the deployment? Initially, they're going to be something called pod, right? Pod is going to create, right? A pod environment is going to create, right? Because pod is the main component which is going to govern the resources which is required by this workload, right? Because what do you mean by deployment? On behind the deployment or the workload, right? there's application, right? So the application means for Kubernetes it's an image, it's a Docker image, right? Or whatever image, right? So what is going to be deployed behind an image? So we are going to pull the image and we are going to run it so that the container will come. Container will come up. There can be one or more images, that depends, right? And so that means image is going to pull and it's going to run so that the application is accessible by the end user, right? So to manage this part, we need something called pod, right? So for this environment, which is going to handle this image and how it's going to manage the resources requested by this image and it's going to run it and the container is going to come up. So it's going to consume processing power, it's going to consume memory, it's going to consume DC space. So like everything will be managed by the pod, right? So still we don't know what is a pod. I think I have given a basic definition for the pod in the previous explanation as well. Just to tell you, pod is the smallest building block in the Kubernetes environment. The smallest building block in architectural wise, smallest architectural building block in the Kubernetes environment, right? So without a pod, you won't be able to manage the resources inside the Kubernetes cluster. Right? So I mean, whenever you do a deployment, you deploy a workload, and workload means behind that you have the containers, right, or the images, right? So to manage those things, we need the pod environment, right? And finally, we have more terms coming in the number of replicas, auto scaling. So let those things to be set for a while. We are not going to explain those things in detail now, but just to give you an idea about what is a deployment. I hope you got it clear. Right, so let's get into the practical and see how the deployment is going to work. So let's do a basic deployment. Now again, in this place, I'm not going to get into manifest file and create a deployment with telling you saw earlier kind, right? We say kind equal pod in our previous manifest file, right? Now if I'm going to do a deployment, I have to say kind equal, not equal, kind is a deployment. This is what I'm telling, right? So let me just open this one again. In our previous practical, this one, we had something called in the manifest file. You may remember this kind, right? Kind colon, what is the category of the resource? Pod. If I'm going to do a deployment, I have to say kind deployment, right? So like there are many resource types. But here we are not going to touch upon those manifest files. We are going to do it on the command line. So later, with greater details, we will do deployments using manifest file, which is happening in the production environment, right? All right. So how do you do a deployment in a command line? We say kubectl create deployment name, and the image behind it, and the tag is latest. That's okay. You can go in version as if you like, and the port 80. So this particular Nginx is going to run by default in port 80. Right. So let's right away run this command, right? You can just run it. And let's clear this screen. Yeah. First thing, clear on my side. So I am inside the Minikube, right? So that's not going to work. Let's exit from here because that's a Docker user. Okay, now I am using Docker user. Here, the user is Docker, that is within Minikube. I have get into the Minikube environment. So now I am in Docker user, right? Okay, now back to normal. So I am inside my virtual machine, right? Okay, let's paste the command, right? All right, it says deployment created, right? So I can get the details of the deployment. I can simply say get deploys, simple terms. We can reduce the typing, get deployed. It will show me the deployment. Right? So you can see I gave the deployment name as my deployment one, and now you can see it is there. And similarly, you can see the container one is running because there was only one container. Why? Because we pulled in only the Nginx container. And I can get the pod details as well. We can say get PO, right? Because what is running behind the deployment is a pod, right? So let's check the pod. Pod will carry the deployment name, right? You can see my dep. So this is going to be the pod name. It's up and running now at the moment, right? So again, I can describe it and see, right? That's okay. Right. So I didn't give a name for the pod. That's why this is carrying with deployment name, and automatically Kubernetes will assign a ID for it. Right. So it's up and running. So that means deployment is up and running. So we can do something like this also. We can say kubectl my dev one. So that this time I describe the deployment. Earlier, we used to describe the pod. We can say describe PO, no? That is what we used to do. Now, what I describe, I want to see more details within the deployment, what's happening, right? So we can see deployment name and app name. I have given that my dev one because I haven't given any customized name. So it takes the deployment name as app name, right? So that's how it's going to be. Replicas, I said I'm not going to display more details here. So let's understand those things later. Rolling update, and there's a big topic. Let's discuss it later. So the port is assigned, and the image behind the deployment for the port that is their Nginx, right? And true minimum, okay, available, minimum replicas available, and normal scaling replica set H97. So deployment control is scaled up replicas to 1. Anyway, just to tell you, since you see the word replica, so replica is nothing much, it's a port. It's a port. In a deployment, normally we don't say, port, right? So when it's come to deployment, we are telling number of replicas, right? Actually, it's going to be, if there is one port, that means one replica, right? It's going to be two port, that means we are going to have two replicas, right? So, when we scaling, we scale the replicas, right? So automatically the containers also will get replicated. It will increase the number of containers. This is for load balancing. So why we are increasing replicas when the load is increasing, to balance it, to distribute it across multiple containers. Multiple, I would say not containers, I would say multiple ports, right? In Kubernetes cluster, we don't manage the loads using containers. That means more the load we are not going to increase the number of containers, right? More the load, we are going to increase the number of ports or the replicas. So in a deployment, when the workload increases, what happens? We can set it to auto scale, to scale up or to increase the number of ports or the number of replicas. Now in this case, one port is having one container. That's what that is what we saw now. My dev one, you can see one out of one port, one container. So what's going to happen if you increase the number of replicas? That means what? You're going to increase the number of ports as well as number of containers. That's what's going to happen. So you are going to have more, right? We may see my dev one, another ID is going to run, another one of one, another one of one. If I say 5 replicas, so what's going to happen? You're going to have my dev one, a different ID is going to appear, different ID is going to appear, 5 times it will get repeated, and you will see one of one, one of one. So don't worry about that. We'll learn more details about replicas later. For the time being, just get an idea. Replica means ports, right? Okay. Right. Auto scaling. You can do manual scale as well. You can increase, right? Okay, right. Let's get back to our guide, right? So that's what just you can see. Yeah, the deploy and pod now it's fine. Deploy, we checked it. Right, now there's another thing. If there's a deployment, automatically the next thing comes in is a service, right? Service means that now this particular Nginx application is running inside the container. It's a web application, right? So we should be able to access that particular web page, which is given by the Nginx container or the Nginx pod, right? So to access, now the container is running within the pod, no? So within the pod or within the cluster, right? So you can't just access it like that. So there must be a mechanism to expose it to outside, right? How the container becomes accessible to outside. You may remember when you're doing the Jenkins practical, we use port mapping. We expose the internal 8080 port to outside using port mapping. But in Kubernetes, we don't do port mappings, right? We do what? Service creation, right? So in Kubernetes services, I mean, that's the method to expose the internal applications to make it available to outside, accessible. To expose the internal applications to outside. That is services. Why I am telling services without telling service? There are different mechanisms. There are altogether by default 4 mechanisms, right? 4 service types are there, right? So here I am going to use out of 4 one type, right? That is type is Nodeport. Don't worry, we'll learn one by one later with more details. So we are going to have a cluster IP service type. We are going to have Nodeport. We are going to have load balancer. Likewise, there are different types. We will learn it later. For the time being, since we want to see the app, we want to access the app because we did the deployment to complete the practical. Let's create a service like this, right? You will see what is happening, right? So let me just create a service. All right, so again, we can say get SVC, the short form I'm using, SVC service. Right? So now you can see the service I just created. I just mentioned expose deployment. My deployment, this is again command line. I am creating a services on command line, not from manifest file. We can create it from manifest file, which is recommended. This is for basic understanding only. We are using command line. So we say kubectl expose deployment name type. Automatically it will create the service expose because of the expose command, right? So then get this CC. You can see this is the service name type Nodeport. Now you can see IP with automatic port mapping internally happening. So we know what is 80. This port 80 we assign when at the time we were deploying the Nginx content. You may remember at the time of deploying, we gave the command, this one, to map it to port 80. Yes, port 80 deployment. So now what we are doing, the internal port 80, we are taking into outside via a service. That's what we are doing, right? This port is mapped to outside as a TCP by default using this particular port, right? We have a cluster IP, right? So this cluster IP also we can use, but within the cluster. If you want to have via the IP, external IP has to be there. But let's not go into that case because in Minikube, these things are working different, little bit different than the actual cluster, right? So let's not worry about this IP, but what we need to understand at the moment, the port mapping, right? So even though I mentioned earlier, the port mapping is not happening within the Kubernetes cluster, but that is something internally managed for us. For outside, it is given as a service. That is how it's going to be, right? So internally, a port mapping takes place, but not like in the Docker environment. Docker environment, we can see the port mapping right away, but here, it is given to us as a service, right? And we have service contain a lot of things, not only the port mapping, right? The port mapping is just a basic thing, right? We have the external IP and internal IP as well, right? Okay. So now we have the service so that we should be able to access this one from outside. Right? So let's continue. Now let's find at what address and port Minikube is running. Not the Minikube. For the Minikube is running the deployment. That's true, right? So let's find at what address and port Minikube is running now deployment because we expose it via a service now. So if you want to get that, so what is the port and the IP? You can see here the same port number where we checked it from here, right? Using the get SVC, you can get the same thing. Right? If you just run it and see, right, it will give you like this, right? So Minikube service mydep, the service name minus URL, right? So you can see this is the Minikube IP, right? That we know, right? That's the Minikube IP, and from that it is accessible to outside using that cluster IP port. This port it will automatically generate whenever you say node port, right? Whenever you say not cluster IP, when cluster IP also will generate a port, but let's keep it away. Whenever you say node port, automatically it will generate this port to us, right? And it will be accessible from outside. That's how, right? And it is not using these IPs, external IP. We can use it, but for the time being, let's keep it for a while. So if you want to access this one right away, what we can do, we can just copy this one. Let's check it right. Okay, let's copy these and right away. Now Nginx port is running, Nginx container is running inside the Kubernetes. So we are going to access that one from outside browser, right? Let's access. We can access from our browser, which is running on the our guest OS, right? So let's paste it. So right away it should be accessible. You can see that. So this is, we are hitting the Kubernetes cluster using that port mapping, right? Using that, even we better not say port mapping, using that Nodeport service. That's what, using that Nodeport service. So since everything is in our local machine, like this, we can access it. Otherwise, we have to get the load balancer like ingress control and all. Let's learn those things later with the real Kubernetes cluster. For the time being, with the very basically, we can access like this using this service, Nodeport service. Okay. Right. So that is that. Yeah, it will, when you come to Nginx, it will show you like that. Okay. Yeah, we can check it from the dashboard. That's fine. In the dashboard, the deployments are there. Yeah, if you want, see the dashboard was running somewhere, right? Thank you, dashboard. Yeah, that you can check it. That's fine. Earlier we used the dashboard, no, right? Because if you want to use the dashboard, so I don't think we need to enable that X11 window as well. I mean X window system, right? Remember in this guide, I think at the top, right? Yeah, we had. Right? Here we have Minikube dashboard. We have to export this one and I can find it. So yeah, I'll leave it to you. I'll just run this one and run the Minikube dashboard and take a look at the Minikube dashboard as well, right? So the same thing can be, I mean, visible these services and let's check it later. For the time being, let's keep it. You can try that out. Right? Okay, so dashboard, yeah, we can delete it. Kubernetes, we can delete the service. Now we can say delete and to remove the service, kubectl delete service. Yeah, let's complete the practical by removing, otherwise the resources are getting flooded. And similarly, we can delete the deployment. Telling this one, you you try to delete a port, it will give error because there's a deployment running. So that's why we are right away deleting a deployment. So later we will learn those things, right? Okay, right. So that is that deployment practical. Right. I have given this reference because this reference from Kubernetes official documentation, that is for you to get an idea about these commands, right? So if you go here, you can see, yes, kubectl cheat sheet. So it will give you the syntaxes, right? So you have kubectl config view, kubectl and the commands, you can see config and those things, right? Kubectl apply, and still we haven't used, we have used the kubectl create command. But here you have, we've been finding this also get services. This is what we did, right? Get ports, right? So yeah, even you can use the minus so wide, right? Let's do those things later, right? To get more details about the port, right? If you want, we can try this out. Right? So just take a look at those commands as well, right? We have to use in the future. To give extra details, right? So now we can see the port IP also being given. So earlier with this command, if you say get port, right? So it don't give the IP address, but it gives shorter details. But if you want to get the port IP details as well, so we can run this command minus o wide the details. So these are the IP address of those ports, right? You can see each port carries a different IP, and we know that we learned already. We have done that. So note these Minikube. Yes, that's okay. All right, I think we are done after that place. So the next is reusing the Docker daemon to accommodate as image repository. Okay, that is something, the next step that we had to do. We are going to compose a Docker image, right, by using a Docker file. I need to understand how to use the repository. It's a very important concept because now we have a Docker environment, we have Minikube environment. Up to now, we have been pulling images from outside. No, we pull Nginx image that is also came from via internet from the official. They are repository, no Nginx official repository, right? But when you compose a new Docker image, where you're going to store, so that is going to be discussed. And what you're trying to do, we are going to have a local repository, create an image, compose it, store in the local repository, and pull it from there itself. Because we are having a Minikube local cluster. So we no need to go for outside for storing our images. So we can store in there itself because there's Docker. Docker is available there, right? So let's do that explanation in the next session. Right. Hope you enjoy the lesson, and if you like the video, you can put a subscribe. So I'll meet you soon. All right. Have a great time. Right. Bye bye.